Hi there, so today we're going to be making a pea pad for the guinea pig cage. This was cut approximately 19 by 19, so hopefully the finished size will be somewhere around 18 or 18 and a half inches by 18 and a half, somewhere around there. If it's a little bit smaller, that's also fine. I don't want it any smaller than 17 inches. That's why I like to give myself a little bit of extra wiggle room, so putting 2 extra inches usually helps with that. So I already have the fabric pinned, and basically what I did was cut the fabric to size and put the 2 correct sides together, stack them on top one another. So this is the wrong side of the fabric. And then on the very back, I put the U-Haul padding. So after this is sewed, we're going to flip it, and the U-Haul will end up in the middle. So this will work even if you want to add a second layer of U-Haul, you can do that too. I usually just like to sew with one because it gets kind of gummy in the machine the more layers you add. So I have my machine set up here, and I'm using a longer stitch length just in case we have a snag. The smaller your stitches are, the harder they are to take out later if you have any issues. So we're going to start at the end here and feed the machine with the opening. So I like to start at where we're going to flip the fleece later. So I leave a pretty good gap, and I don't put pins there, so I remember not to sew there. So we're going to meet back around on that side, but we're going to leave a pretty big opening so that we can flip the fleece without any issues. So I like to sew at about 1/2 inch to 1 inch depending on how big the item is. For this one, we're going to do 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. If it was a liner, I would do 1 inch just to give yourself extra room, but also it keeps the fabric, the U-Haul, from moving on the edges. But we are going to sew around later after we have this all sewed and flipped. So we're going to go ahead and sew our 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. And always make sure your presser foot is down. I like this presser foot. This is called it'll come to me. I'll come back to that. But this is a bigger presser foot, and it's made to go through thick layers. And because we have 3 layers here, sometimes you can't tell when the presser foot is down. So you always want to triple check, make sure it's on the down position, because if it's not, you will have a big tangled mess, which is not fun to take out. So let's go ahead and sew this. And always make sure to back stitch. And if you're doing a liner, you want to make sure that your table is pulled out a little bit so that you have some room for it to slide down onto the floor depending on how big it is. And towards the end here, you're going to put your needle in the down position. My machine automatically stops in the upright position, which is technically good, but when you're turning corners, you want to make sure it's in the fabric so you don't have skipping stitches. And you're going to turn the fabric and continue going. And always place a hand on this side and one here. So you're basically, when you're feeding it, you want to make sure that it's not moving and shifting in places that you don't want it to. I sew over the pins, but that's totally up to you if you want to pull them out. I usually don't because I really don't need to. should stop every so often, make sure that nothing's getting snagged. Where's my pin cushion? And I usually leave the pin cushion here. Occasionally I'll forget it on the table though. I like to pin my fabric as much as I can, so most people would say pin it every 3 inches. I like to do every maybe 1.5 to 2 inches. 2 inches if it's a liner or a pea pad. If it's a really big liner, like a 2x5 or bigger, then I like to do it every 1.5 inches or so, because it keeps the fabric from shifting from your original cut size. And trust me, if it's not equal to the original cut size, then you're going to have weird crooked edges. Okay, we're going to turn, making sure that it's in the down position. If you find that your fabric is pulling or wrinkling over your pins, what you're going to do is take that pin out and you're going to use your 2 fingers and stretch the fabric on either side of the needle. Press your foot really gently so that it goes through really nice and smoothly, and just give it a good pull and it should take out the wrinkle. It's better to have the stretchy fabric, so before you start sewing, when you're cutting and deciding which one to sew on top and which one to put on the bottom, or in this case in the middle while you're sewing, put the stretchiest one on the top. That way it gives you more room, and you know that the one on the bottom is not going to move, so you can fit the stretchy one to the original size, if that makes sense. So as I said before, this is probably, actually, now that I'm looking at it, it's going to probably end up being an 18 by 18 inch piece. And that is because we did 1/2 inch seam allowance on each of the sides, so 1 inch in total. So 2 inches in total. So 1 inch for this side, 1 inch for this side.
You're sewing?
Yes, can you guys keep it down? I'm making a video. So we're getting towards the side where the opening is. And this is our last side, and it goes about, let's see, about 5 inches in. So I'll show you what I did for the entrance to make sure that you don't sew there, because it is easy to forget and you can easily sew right over it, and then you gotta open up the fabric. So that's so fun. So as you can see, I finished on the same, so I started over here. Oh wait, nope. I started over here, went all the way around and met back over here and left this big opening so that we can flip our fabric around. So now you can take out all of your pins, and I have a magnetic thing. You can get this at any fabric store with glass head pins. I use the glass head pins because you can iron over them, and this is amazing because if I had like a flat surface, I would just pull out all the pins and you could just take this and suck them up. So, pins. So as I said before, the U-Haul padding is going to end up in the middle once we flip this, and we will just sew a little square around it. Some people would sew the two fabrics together first and then slide the U-Haul in. You can do it that way. I don't like to though, and I'll tell you why. Because when you sew them on the edges like this, when you already sew it to the fabric, you are reassured that it's not going to move around in there while you're trying to sew your little square to hold it in place. So this has the double reinforcement for not shifting. So I always like to go around, make sure you get all the pins. You don't want your piggies getting stuck with anything. Okay. And you can grab a pair of scissors and take off the little pieces of string. And now we're going to flip it. So we have basically like a 3-pocket kind of thing. So we're going to take where the two fabrics are and we're going to flip it around. And also I like to cut the corners before we flip it. That way when we're sewing our square, the corners don't get jammed. Where are my good scissors? Hold on. So when you cut the corners this way, when you're sewing your little square around, it doesn't get jammed because that tends to feel like a lot of layers trying to get under the machine. Depending on how big or small you make your square. So I'll show you how I make the square as well. Okay. So all of our corners are cut. Let's find our opening and we're going to flip it. So I'm going to pull it through, and this is why I like to leave a big opening. The bigger the piece, the bigger the opening I leave, just so you don't have to be pulling at the fabric and breaking the stitches you already made. So you want to make sure you get those corners popped out. And you can use your scissors for that to push the corners out. Make sure they're closed so you don't snap them shut and they cut something. Just keep them closed, stick it in there, and kind of push at the corners. Like that. So you have nice popped out corners. Alright, so this is our square, and as you can see, the right sides are now facing outwards, the pretty sides that we want to see in our cage later. So now we're going to close up this, and this can be a little tricky because sometimes when you sew them, especially if you're a beginner, this can look a little funky the first times you try to sew it. So it's a little bulky on this side because this side is the one that has the U-Haul attached to it. If you can see what I mean. It's like kind of on this side more than this side. So we're gonna fold that in to match this so that it's leveled out. So you're gonna fold that in nicely and fold this one in to match it. So it should look like this. See how nice and straight that is? And we're gonna sandwich it with our fingers. And now we're gonna pin it shut. Let's see, where can I put my laptop to do this? I'll turn you around. Okay. So here's our opening, like I said, and you might want to adjust it a few times before you pin it so that we have a nice clean seam later. So I'm going to pin it at the very end. So I'm going to kind of put my finger there and just feel for where the very end is. It's right there. And I like to sew a little before that just to reinsure that it's going to be sealed off on the ends. So, and you kind of have to adjust it as you go along. You might want to just like pull it a little bit from underneath. And put your pins about an inch apart from each other so that it doesn't pull. And like I said, you gotta kind of feel around and make sure it feels right to you and make sure it feels and looks straight when you're done. And these, as we sew the edge of this, I kind of pull the pins out a little bit so that the little ball part doesn't get stuck under my needle and break my needle. So let's pin the end here. And then we'll close it off with one more pin. So I'm going to sew just a smidge before the first pin and a smidge before the last pin. So this is how it looks right now before we sew it. Now let's go back over to our machine. Go. And we're going to sew this closed. So I like to sew it as close to the edge as possible, and that is because we don't have a ton of seam allowance on the red side as we do as the snowman side, because the snowman side has the U-Haul padding attached to it, because that's where we sewed it. So we're going to give a little less than half a seam, inch seam allowance. Uh-oh, ran out of bobbin. We'll use this one. So again, you want to sew this. At this point, it doesn't matter which one is more stretchy. It does matter for when you do the square on the inside, which side is more stretchy, because you don't want that side at the bottom because it'll pull when you're trying to sew. But for now, this will do. Actually, this will do for the square too. It's fine. Okay, so we got our bobbin filled. Foot down, pick up the bobbin. Go. And make sure you got a long tail. Mine's hard to grab because I haven't Alright. So it's a little less than 1/2 inch seam allowance, and remember we're starting a little bit before the pin. Okay, so I'll pull out that first pin because we have a good grasp on it. Make sure you press your foot's down and start sewing. I like to sew this part a little bit slower sometimes depending on how I'm feeling about it. If it's a bigger piece, I usually go a little bit slower just because I want to make sure that it's not pulling on one side and not on the other. So make sure you do your back stitch. And you can kind of pull the pins out just a smidge before you go over them so that the ball doesn't get stuck in your machine. Alright. So we're going to leave a long tail here like we always do. So cut that there. Alright, so now we're going to take out our pins. And cut our little strings off. Okay, so we have our nice crisp edge there, so it kind of blends in. Some people like to use this and go all the way around so it blends in. I don't usually do that, but you can if you want to. I usually just do one square in the middle, which is what I'm going to show you next. So we're going to use this side for that because this fabric is stretchier than our snowman fabric. Now, the size of the square that goes in here is completely up to you. Some people do it 1 inch away from the edge. Some do 2. I just go with a ruler that I have, and I believe it is 2 inches wide. So we're going to go about 2 inches from the edge here. So flip you back around. So we got the side that we're using. And what I like to do before I start drawing in my square is flattening out the edges and just flattening out everything overall, kind of pull the edges a little bit to make sure that they're not tucked in there when you're sewing. Okay, and where's my ruler? Okay. Now for this part, I like to just draw it all the way around, and I don't like to do a closed square. I find it easier for me, and I don't think it looks bad. I think it looks kind of cute actually. I do straight lines so to make a box. So what I do is, I'll show you it's better if I show you. So I kind of feel out the edge here, and this is where the U-Haul padding is on the edge, that it's a little bit thicker than right here. So I put it right on the edge of there, my ruler. So again, this is about 2 inches wide, 2.5, somewhere around there. And I don't want to go all the way at the tip here, but I go maybe another inch down about there. And I use an Expo marker for this, and that's because this will come off in the wash. You should wash your fleece after you sew it, before you send it out to your customers if you're using this for selling purposes, and that is because fleece needs to be wicked and make sure that it's wicked before it's actually used. And what that means is basically that it will allow urine or water or anything to pass through to our absorbent layer. So it should be washed prior to being sold or used. So there are detergents. You could use a regular detergent. I prefer the 7th generation detergent if you're selling, because it won't make it look like it's been used already. It'll make it look like it's just been washed once. So again, I use an Expo marker. There are fabric markers, but you can't, fabric marker comes off with an iron, and you can't iron fleece because it will melt. So I like to do a nice thin line here. My ruler is. And I don't draw it super dark so you can't like really see it. So there's our line. And like I said, we're gonna sew right over that too, so it'll get tucked in, but also when you wash this, it'll come right off. A permanent marker will not, so make sure it's an Expo marker. And we're gonna go on the sides. And just make sure you're feeling, we're going right at the edge here. And you can totally do this square any way you want. If you don't want these little pieces sticking out, that's fine. Then just draw your square. Just make it a perfect square. I like to do these edges because, again, I like to sew straight. I like to do straight lines instead of sewing around. I find that when I sew around, for some reason, it pulls on the other side. And I don't like that, obviously, because it doesn't look professional and it doesn't look super clean. So I don't mind the points. And actually, a couple of vendors that I know do that, do it this way as well. Budget Bunny is one. So I'll hold it up so you can see it. So we have a square with little X's at the back on the edges. So again, kind of flatten this out. I just put air in it. And now we're gonna pin. I think it is so important to pin your square because, as I said, what happens to me is that it'll pull on the opposite side. So you'll be sewing and you're thinking, wow, it's coming out great. And then you flip it around and you see that the edges have been pulled. And that happens from not pinning. Some people are able to do it without pinning and not have a problem. I do have that problem, so I prefer to pin, but that's completely up to you. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this. And it doesn't need to be like double pinned, so in and out, in and out. I just put it in once. And we have no openings here, so we're just going to pin all the way around our square. And make the necessary stops. You could also just draw these and still go around the entire square to just make it a square. But again, that's up to you. I don't mind these little crisscross thingies, and I think they look kind of cute after it's done. I know Budget Bunny makes hers a little bit smaller than mine. She makes them like an inch out, but I like to make this thick crease or allowance. I'm not really sure why, I just like the way it looks. Maybe for a pea pad like this, you could probably go a little bit smaller, but I think the bigger width you have on your stitching here, for a liner, it looks really nice compared to a thin one. And some people do multiple squares, so they'll do like this one and then they'll sew another one within this. And I don't really find the need to do that. I think it looks fine with just one, and it works with just one because we've sewed the U-haul to our fleece. So we already have that extra reinforcement. We don't really need any more. So you want to make sure your pins are going through all 3 layers and coming out the other end because you don't want any of them to shift. And I'm pinning about 2 inches apart. And that's just eyeballing it. I'm not measuring. Okay. Last side. So I'll show you what I mean by stops when I start sewing this last part. Alright, so we got our fleece and it's pinned, and it looks good on the other side. There's no pulls, and we can start sewing again.
You gonna go with that?
Mom, I'm making a video right now. Okay, so we're going to start at the tippy top here of our first point, sew all the way down, and then we're going to take it out. So basically you want to make sure if you are going to do these crisscross things that you backstitch, obviously when you start and when you finish. So I like to make sure that it's right on the line. So I'm going to put my needle in my down position. It is on the line. And presser foot is down. And sew straight on the line. And again, you don't really need to take your pins out. I don't take them out till after, and that also reassures that it's not going to wrinkle on this side. And this is also good to practice pulling your fabric, like I said, with your 2 fingers. This time you can use both hands and you can just pull it as you go through the machine. And this will ensure that you don't have any wrinkles over your pins. And that does happen sometimes, and I mean, it's not terrible if you get one pin that wrinkles, but you want to try and not do that, especially if you're wanting to sell these. You want it to be flat and as professional as possible. And this takes practice, it really does. Don't be upset if you don't get perfect stitches on your first try. If you get a few lumps and bumps or any wrinkles here and there, don't be discouraged. Just keep trying and work on smaller projects before you work on the bigger ones. So make a lot of pea pads. I mean, we can never have enough pea pads. You can use them for absolutely anything. You can use them for lap time. You can use them for, I don't know, just everyday cage use, for underwater bottles. You can use them for 1,000 things. So don't, I honestly actually prefer practicing with these before moving on to something bigger, because it is the same concept, but as I said before, because it's a smaller canvas to work with, basically you make less mistakes, because you don't have to worry about letting the fabric go to the back of the wall. And sometimes the bigger the pieces, the heavier it is, and it starts pulling, and then you got problems with that. You got to hold it, you got to kind of pull it up while you're trying to sew, and that takes a lot of practice before that gets to perfection as well. So that is our first stitch. See, nice and clean. On this side, nice and clean. So now we're going to move on to our second side. And it does not matter which side you pick first. Remember, we put the stretchy side on top so that we don't have to worry about pulling or anything. So again, making sure our needle is in the down position, so we make sure that it's sewing straight, and the presser foot is on the down position as well. And making sure we do our back stitch, and making sure we pull our fabric outwards, so this way and that, to make sure we don't get any bumps over our pins. And the more you practice this, the faster you get at sewing a straight line without having to worry about creases and things like that. But that's why pins are so important. The more you pin, really, the straighter the line you get. But it's also based on your cutting skills. You have to make sure that when you cut your fabric originally, that you cut it as straight as you can and to the best of your ability, because that will dictate the end result and on what it looks like, especially shape-wise. If this was meant to be a square, which it is, it needs to look like a square. I think doing these straight lines, I recommend doing it this way instead of a box, because I'm telling you, it comes out looking crisper than a box does. The box takes a lot of practice, which I have done one successfully without any wrinkles or any issues, but just for the sake of time, this looks just as nice. And like I said, you can always make the this width a little bit smaller and make these X's a little bit smaller if you don't like the big ones. An Expo actually sometimes also comes out if you just rub it a little bit, but it will come out in the wash for sure. And don't, when you draw your square or whatever shape you're making in the middle, don't make the line super dark. Just draw it enough that you can see it, because the darker that you make it, then you will see it. And I don't know if it'll come out in the wash, because I usually just do like a little faint line just to make sure I can see it. Oops, we ran out of thread. I should have checked that before we started. Alright. So that means if that does happen, I don't know what stage of sewing you are. If you're a beginner, you want to, what am I doing with that? You want to make sure you know how to thread your machine, but also because it's stopped in the middle of our piece, we now have to find where that last stitch was and go back over that and back stitch over it to make sure that it's locked in place and that it won't come out or come undone. So I do have a self threader, but I don't use it because I have no idea how to. But also threading it by hand also just, it's easier for me. So here is our last stitch. And we just threaded our machine again. So we have thread, we're good to go. So we want to find our last place and go about an inch back from that. Oh, I need that. Go about an inch back from where it last stopped, and sew over it and backstitch over it. So we're finding that place. And then we got our needle over it. We get the thread cap. All right, so we're in business, making sure our presser foot is down. We're going over it. That's the end of the stitch that we last stopped, so we're going to go over it and continue sewing. And I'll show you what it looks like so far. We have one more side to do before we are all done with this project. And this took a little bit of time just for video purposes and making sure I explain every step so that you won't miss any. So that's what it's looking like on this side, nice and crisp. We got nice edges. And let's do our last side and we're done. The good thing about pulling it also is it's ensuring that whatever's you're sewing to it on the bottom is also being pulled that way. So it's sewing in the same direction as the top is. Because you can't always see what's going on at the bottom, which is why I mentioned earlier that sometimes you get snags at the bottom, but you can't see them until you're done with the project, and then you gotta be taking out stitches. So that's another reason this line thing is so much better than a square, because if you turn it over halfway through and you see that it's snagged, you only have one line to take out as opposed to a whole square. Alright, so we are done. Cut the strings on here before I show you. So you want to make sure you go on every single stop you made and make sure that you cut the strings. These are hazardous for piggies, especially if you're selling your liners and pea pads. You want to make sure that all these little threads are gone. They can get stuck in the piggy's feet and a bunch of other stuff, so you want to make sure they're all gone. So cut as close to the edge as possible. And if you had a stop like I did to fill your thread, then you want to also make sure you go over the parts that you stopped at and make sure you cut the string there as well. And I'm going to talk to you about the string that I use before I log off here, because it is honestly the best of the best. Alright, we got all of our strings, so now we can take out all of our pins. And again, we want to double check that after we're completely done with the project, because I have accidentally left pins. I usually catch it before I put it in the cage, but if you're selling these and they're already shipped out, you want to make sure that you didn't leave any pins behind. And if you're kind of a forgetful person or someone who it'll pass over your head, then count the pins as you put them in and maybe write it down on like a sticky note here. And if you have to take any out while you're sewing, then just subtract from the original amount you put there. So cut See, another reason we go around, I missed 2 strings, and I thought I got them all. So, all right, so we're gonna feel around, make sure we didn't leave any pins. Nope. Okay, we are good. So this is our finished pea pad, and like I said, I don't think these look bad at all. I mean, I guess they would bother some people who are making them. It doesn't bother me though. And when you're sewing and you pick out your thread color, if you could just match it, then you won't even really see those. And this is our other side. So we have a snowman on this side, and mints and buttons on this one, and snowflakes. And as you can see, our seam here also looks super professional, super clean, and this is ready to be thrown in the wash and then ready for use. So we have 1 layer of U-Haul and 2 layers of fleece. So it's a pretty thick absorbency. And again, you can add as many layers of U-Haul as you want. I don't really think it's necessary. To be honest with you, I don't think it does the job of, wicking away the pea any better than 1, because you do have to change the cage eventually. Some people swear by it. So I usually only do multiple layers of U-Haul by request, and I do charge extra for it because it is an expense. So again, this is our lovely piece, all finished, crisp edges, and we got a nice square. So let me talk to you about the thread before I log off. So I use the Gutermann thread, and this you can get at Joann's, and I'm not really sure, depending on where you live, you can order these online. So this is what it looks like. The spool, it's a little bit longer than the usual one, and there's tons of reasons why this thread is the best. Number 1, it's made out of polyester. What is it, like 90% polyester? No, I think it's 100% polyester. Yep, 100% polyester. It says that right there. So, and it comes in a million different colors. I have a tower full of different spool colors. And so it's 100% polyester. Regular thread has this gummy material on top of the thread, which is not good for any machines. It can actually, that's why a lot of people get stuck when they're sewing, or it gets tacked together and it starts spinning. Also, the regular thread does wear away over time due to the stuff that's put on it, the wax. So this is long-lasting thread. It will last your liners for years and many, many washes to come. It's just a strong, heavy-duty kind of thread, and honestly the best for these kind of projects because they're super thick. You want a really good, strong, heavy thread that's not going to pull apart, or when you're washing, you start seeing thread coming apart. So this is great for that. It's called Gutermann. I believe it's German. I'm not sure though. Gutermann. So again, these can be found at Joann's, and there's a bajillion colors. So, and you can't go wrong with that kind of thread. So that is it. I hope you enjoyed my tutorial video, and I hope your projects come out nice and crisp and professional looking. And if you have any questions for me in the future, please feel free to message me. All right, bye-bye.